Marina, thank you so very, very much. There will be many connections. Our second next speaker, Jean-Yves Dadier, wrote the book Le Lac Inconnu, Entre Proust and Freud. So we'll hear more about Freud then. But I've now got the great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Mariana Castillo Deball, who was born in Mexico City, studied at the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht, also at the University in Mexico. Her many exhibitions include the Museum of Latino American Art in Long Beach, the Kunsthalle St. Gallen, the Museo Carrillo-Gil in Mexico, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. She participated, among other things, in the last Venice Biennale 2011, exhibited at the Meuron Museum, at Tate Modern, the ICA, and also won the award, the Zurich Art Prize. Here in the Memory Marathon, Mariana's participation includes the sculpture you will see on stage. It's titled something like the memory of a monument becoming heavier because it's a memory. Something like the memory of a monument becoming heavier because it's a memory. A very warm welcome to Mariana Castillo Deball.
Hi, how are you? Can you hear me or not? No. Maybe they need to switch on the microphone. Now it's good. Yeah. I will start telling you a story. It's a thought experiment, as they call it, that was started by Wilfred Molyneux, who was a French philosopher in the 17th century. And he proposed a very simple question. He thought, what would happen if we would give a sphere and a cube to a blind person? This person would recognize these two objects from touch perfectly. What would happen if this person would recover sight and be confronted to these two objects? Would he be able to recognize these objects or not? So this question, a very simple one, kept on for years and centuries. And it was not so much like a practical answer what was important. It was more important the philosophical implications of the question, which was if we actually have something like Platonic images in our soul or in our brain, like we have a cube imprinted forever because it's a perfect shape, or if it's something that depends on perception and on experience. So after there were many different experiments where they they did perform this kind of operations on blind people, and the result was always different. So you cannot say that there is a solution for this problem. Some people would not recognize the shapes at all. Some people would start recognize them after a while, after years or after months of learning. So I've been always very curious about this problem. And I did an experiment once on myself, let's say on my capacity of learning through touch and through vision, and how that is connected to memory or to the concepts or the things we believe about reality. So I asked a friend it was in 2001, in March 2001, and I asked a friend that during 1 month he would give me one different object every day. And then I would make a drawing of this object without looking at the object. Then the next day I would make a drawing looking at the object. And a month after, I would make a drawing from memory of this thing. So this went on for 1 month, so it was a sort of diary. And I will show you just some interesting examples, not all of them. So this is one of the first objects that I drew by touching. This is the same one. This was by looking at the object. And what was interesting also is that depending on the thing, sometimes the touch was more relevant than actually what I could look at afterwards. And this was also very important in the moment when I build up a memory of it. So sometimes the vision was more dominant, and sometimes the memory of touching the object was more dominant. This is a pencil, for example, but the pencil was completely beaten. So you know when you're very nervous and you're biting a pencil for many, many days. So it had a lot of texture. So even when I made the drawing, looking at the pencil, this texture was more important. It became more important because I had already studied it by touch. And these are the memory drawings that actually are stamps. So I made a collection of stamps out of this. You can guess what it is. Sometimes it's difficult, sometimes it's easy. So what I realized, maybe it's in my case in particular, but actually touch made a big difference on the way I could relate to things afterwards while looking at them. This is a piece of paper that had a print. So sometimes the two experiences of the object were completely contradictory, because if you have a piece of paper and this paper has something printed on it, of course they are just completely different objects if you experience them through these senses. This was a rubber band. So something also important is when sometimes movement became very important, or space, or how the object would behave in space. And this became part of the object. That otherwise it wouldn't have been the case, I believe. This is my favorite one. Someone knows what it is? This is another one. Well, it's a sponge. Yeah, this is a sad case because, for example, in the stamp or in the memory, I couldn't put this imprint of the experience of touching it. Anyway, I started, in the recent years, I started to think about this same problem, but in the context of archaeology. And I discovered that in the 19th century, many archaeologists who went to, let's say, to Mexico, because that's where I come from. So I've been researching on that a lot. Many archaeologists, they went to those places and they wanted to have an imprint. They wanted to have a memory. Sometimes they wanted to have the whole thing, as we can see in the museums. But frequently they would there and make pictures or make drawings of the objects. And they also started to do molds. Molds made out of plaster or molds made out of paper, which are called paper squeezes. And this is one image of how these paper squeezes are done. So basically it's like papier-mâché, and they put it over the object, and then it dries, and then you have an imprint of this object. The advantage is that it's very light, and it's very easy to transport. The disadvantage is that if there is a little bit of humidity, then the paper squeeze would become something like yogurt, or it would just disappear. And so there is a British archaeologist and explorer who made a lot of these paper molds, which are now in the British Museum here in London. And I went to look at some of them. This is how they would do it. It was very difficult because in the jungle it's very humid. So they would put this paper on the sculptures, and they would wait until it would dry. And then they would make like fires around these things, so So they would actually be able to take it out of the original object. And then after that, they would take this paper mold to London. So they would transport it overseas. Then they would make a plaster cast out of it. And then someone else would make a drawing. For them, the most important thing was the drawing, because then they could start to understand the Maya inscriptions. Because in this case, he went to Guatemala and to Mexico in the Maya region. And so I thought this was a crazy amount of multiplication of different kinds of memories of the same object. Needless to say that these plaster casts, they occupy almost the same or more space as the original sculptures. So you need like huge amounts of space to store them. And also, many of these casts, they have a different memory, or the memory is betterly preserved than the original monument that probably was destroyed or it was damaged by erosion. So these molds are very precious. And then while looking at the archive of this British archaeologist, Maud Lisset, I found this image that I found that was a very interesting case of archaeological excavation. So there was a tree, and underneath the tree there was something that was showing out. And so they realized that it was a huge monolith that this tree had grew over the centuries on top of it. So they cut out the tree, and then they kind of made again a plaster cast and a copy and a drawing. But I thought that this moment, when there was a sort of fusion between archaeology and the organic development of the jungle, was somehow lost in this brutal gesture of just cutting it and taking it out. I mean, why do we need to do these kind of things? And so myself, I started to do a series of paper squeezes in different parts of the world where I've been traveling. And they are not related to archaeological sites, but more to urban imperfections or urban moments or trees that I find. And so this is one that I did in Mexico. In Mexico City, it happens many times that there is a tree, and the roots of the tree start growing under the pavement. So the pavement starts distorting, and then you cannot even walk anymore because it's really massive. So this is one example. It's a sort of one-to-one imprint of this situation, of this moment. And then you can just take it out, take it home, and it's very light. This is how it looks, more or less. This is another one I did in Mexico. In Berlin. I did it very recently. So I like it because it's really like wrapping the thing. So it's really like embracing an object completely, and you really need to map the object and to memorize it by hand. So you really need to use your sense of touch. And then afterwards, when it's dry, you need to cut it out like a kind of dress, and then it comes like a skin. So it's like a memory skin. They look a bit like monsters once they are already out of the original shape, but it's somehow interesting. So I wonder which kind of memory is this, or if it's a memory. And I brought an example that I made recently in Scotland, just so you have a sense. I couldn't bring a very massive one, but it was done in Scotland this year in the summer. And thank you.